No one expected this. One of the largest aerospace manufacturers in the world, a company that once symbolized American pride and technological dominance, is now caught in the middle of a political and economic firestorm. Boeing, the name alone once inspired confidence, patriotism, and a sense of limitless industrial possibility. But in 2025, the story looks very different. It began with quiet murmurs from global suppliers and distant airports, whispers of delayed orders and shifting priorities. But those whispers soon turned into chaos. At the heart of it all, tariffs, retaliation, and a fierce reaction from the White House. Boeing's decision to explore limited production outside the U.S. triggered a response that no one could have anticipated, a 200% tariff threat and a furious phone call from President Trump himself. The message was clear: build every single jet on U.S. soil or face consequences. There would be no negotiation, no economic nuance, no consideration for a strained global supply chain or emerging international demand. It was an ultimatum. A line drawn not in sand, but across the future of American aerospace. And that's when the retaliation began. China, once a crucial buyer of Boeing's commercial aircraft, slammed the brakes. It halted all deliveries and imposed steep tariffs on American-made planes and their parts. Overnight, billions of dollars in contracts were frozen. Aircraft ready for departure were left idle, engines silent. Orders meant for Asia were rerouted back to Boeing's factories, empty, unfinished, and unclaimed. Entire communities in Wichita, Kansas, and Everett, Washington, towns that depended on Boeing, were thrust into uncertainty. Shift workers were sent home. Assembly lines slowed to a crawl. Local economies that once thrived on Boeing's promise now faced the unthinkable: mass layoffs and industrial stagnation. In just days, the dominoes fell. What had started as a strategic pivot toward cost efficiency turned into a geopolitical standoff, with Boeing cast as the villain, not for failing, but for trying to survive. And yet, the company didn't retreat. Boeing's leadership, under CEO Kelly Ortberg, responded publicly, challenging the narrative. The move to expand abroad wasn't a betrayal, they argued, but a necessity. Demand in Southeast Asia, India, and Latin America was exploding. Supply chains were crumbling. Building jets where they were needed most wasn't just practical, it was survival. But Washington wouldn't hear it. Loyalty was the only acceptable currency. And as Boeing dug in, the pressure intensified. The political theater drowned out economic logic. Still, something unexpected happened. Despite the crisis, Boeing's production didn't collapse. It shifted. Planes once earmarked for China were redirected. Deliveries to Latin America picked up pace. Emerging markets filled the void left by fractured trade relationships. And slowly, painfully, the company began to find its footing, not in the headlines but in the numbers. By mid-2025, Boeing was producing 38 jets per month, with projections to ramp up to 42 by year's end. Sales in non-traditional markets surged. Honeywell, one of Boeing's key suppliers, revised its earnings forecast upward, pointing to Boeing's resilience as a driving force. Analysts cautiously began to shift from panic to optimism. But the damage was done. Even with a growing backlog of 5,600 aircraft orders and revenue climbing to $19.5 billion in the first quarter of 2025, Boeing was still bleeding. Free cash flow remained negative, $2.3 billion down. And the political cost? Incalculable. Boeing, once the golden child of American industry, was now navigating hostile waters. Behind the boardroom strategies and quarterly projections, a deeper question began to emerge. What is the cost of patriotism when it's wielded as punishment? When building abroad becomes a betrayal, and thinking globally is treated as disloyalty. Because for every Boeing plane grounded by tariffs, there were real people behind the loss. Engineers. Technicians. Entire towns built around factory floors now stood at risk because a single company chose to adapt instead of collapse. And Boeing wasn't alone. Across corporate America, CEOs began to watch closely. The message was loud: toe the political line or face ruin. But the question lingered: could any company, even one as massive and essential as Boeing, truly operate in this climate? As competitors like Airbus surged forward, boasting faster delivery schedules, cleaner technologies, and fewer political constraints, the cracks in America's industrial policy became harder to ignore. Boeing was still delivering planes, still fighting to innovate. But innovation was no longer enough. Because this isn't just about aircraft. It's about what happens when an economy turns on its own builders. When slogans replace strategy. When headlines become more important than long-term survival. As the White House continued its barrage of criticism, Boeing found itself facing an entirely new type of turbulence, one not related to engineering or aerodynamics, but perception. The company that once launched astronauts, supplied fighter jets, and connected continents now stood accused of abandoning the very nation it helped build. President Trump didn't hold back. In rally after rally, he denounced the company by name, calling Boeing's leadership traitors to American labor. His message resonated with some, especially in the Rust Belt and manufacturing towns still scarred from previous decades of outsourcing. But for the engineers and managers within Boeing's walls, the accusations cut deeper. They weren't leaving America. They were trying to keep the company, and its legacy, alive in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. Because while Washington played politics, the global aviation sector kept moving. Airbus struck fresh deals with India and the UAE. Brazil's Embraer rolled out a new regional jet model with competitive pricing and zero tariffs. China accelerated the rollout of the C919, its first domestically produced commercial jet, offering it at discounted rates to markets previously dominated by Boeing. The playing field had changed. And as Boeing tried to keep up, it also had to fend off misinformation. Media cycles spun stories of mass shutdowns and total collapse. In reality, Boeing was reorganizing, consolidating its operations in places like South Carolina while scaling back in high-cost zones hit hardest by the tariffs. Yet perception outweighed nuance. In the public eye, the shutdown of even one production line looked like betrayal. Behind the scenes, logistics teams worked overtime. Contracts had to be renegotiated. Supply chains rebalanced. New partners sought in regions not subject to punitive trade policies. Boeing even began considering limited component production in Canada, a move that stirred even more controversy but was viewed internally as a lifeline to stabilize manufacturing costs. But the numbers told a story that politics refused to admit. Despite being under siege from all sides, Boeing's international market share began to inch upward. Demand from Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America created unexpected revenue pockets. Even more surprising, some U.S. allies quietly reached out, offering incentives to relocate select production lines away from conflict zones and closer to ports or neutral trading blocs. These weren't betrayals. They were adaptations, hard decisions made to prevent a collapse that could ripple across the entire U.S. economy. Because Boeing isn't just a company. It anchors hundreds of suppliers, tens of thousands of jobs, and entire states' economic health. When Boeing shakes, the country feels it. Still, the administration refused to budge. Threats escalated. Sanctions were considered. Talk of revoking federal contracts made headlines. But beneath the surface, there was another reality emerging. The rest of the world was moving on. Global buyers couldn't wait for America to sort out its internal disputes. They needed planes, and they needed them now, from whoever could deliver. And while Trump's anger made for compelling television, it did little to bring buyers back. Instead, it pushed them further away. Meanwhile, Boeing pressed forward. Production goals were revised, not abandoned. Engineers innovated new modular assembly methods to allow flexible builds across borders. Entire teams were dedicated to risk management, not of technical failures, but of geopolitical ones. Because in 2025, the greatest threat to Boeing's future wasn't faulty parts or delayed timelines. It was Washington. And so the company fought a war on two fronts, building for the skies while dodging missiles from Capitol Hill. In many ways, Boeing became a symbol of modern industrial America, powerful yet vulnerable, necessary but resented. It operated on a tightrope, balancing between national expectations and global realities. And it's still walking that line. Because while this chapter may be coming to a close, the larger story of America's manufacturing soul, and its uncertain place in a fracturing global economy, is far from over. In cities like Wichita and Everett, the fallout wasn't theoretical, it was lived. Cafes once filled with aerospace engineers sat half empty. Local suppliers reported contract suspensions. And for the younger workforce, many of whom had spent years training for high-skill aviation careers, the future became a question mark. Some clung to hope. Others began looking elsewhere, abroad, or into completely different industries. But perhaps the most revealing shift came from the global investment community. Markets watched the drama unfold, not with panic, but with recalculation. Funds began adjusting their risk profiles for US-based aerospace companies. Insurance firms reviewed their exposure. Some European buyers openly questioned whether future American orders were worth the potential political risk. The US, once seen as the gold standard in aerospace reliability, was now viewed through a different lens: volatile, uncertain, politically vulnerable. And yet, inside Boeing's command structure, there remained a silent resolve. No public counterattack. No high-profile press blitz. Just spreadsheets, schedules, and survival planning. Behind closed doors, executives mapped out scenarios, from the optimistic to the catastrophic. What if more federal contracts were pulled? What if international sanctions emerged from retaliatory trade actions? What if the FAA itself became weaponized through selective regulation? And yet, even amid all of that, planes kept being built. Because at the end of the day, the world still needed them. Aircraft demand didn't vanish, it just moved. Emerging economies in Africa and South Asia began placing bulk orders. Cargo carriers, strained by post-pandemic bottlenecks, sought next-generation freighters. Even nations traditionally aligned with the US began to hedge, diversifying fleets with mixed origin sourcing. And all the while, Trump kept tweeting. His frustration was raw. Perhaps it was personal. Perhaps it was political. But his narrative was clear: Boeing was abandoning America. In reality, Boeing was trying not to be abandoned by America itself. Because loyalty works both ways. And in a world where commerce moves faster than legislation, companies don't get to wait for politicians to catch up. They have to move. Adapt. Or disappear. The final twist? Whispers began circulating that Boeing was in preliminary talks with foreign governments, not just for exports, but for collaborative R&D hubs. Not outsourcing. Co-innovation. Shared production. Shared gains. A new model of manufacturing in a world that's increasingly borderless. Some called it betrayal. Others called it evolution. Either way, the result was the same: the US no longer held a monopoly on innovation. And Boeing, once the crown jewel of American engineering, now found itself answering a different kind of question. Not, can you build it? But, can you survive where you built it? And if Boeing can't escape that question, no American manufacturer can. Because this isn't just a Boeing story. Or a Trump story. Or even an aviation story. This is about the quiet erosion of industrial stability. With each week, the headlines intensified. Boeing pivots abroad, U.S. aerospace dominance in question. Trump vows retaliation. But behind those headlines, something deeper was happening. American manufacturing, long considered untouchable, was proving to be just as fragile as any sector exposed to geopolitical tension, cost pressures, and domestic gridlock. And as Boeing tiptoed through this minefield, other companies took notice. Quietly, defense contractors began exploring fallback plans. Tech manufacturers, once content to expand within the U.S., began scouting foreign assembly zones. Even agricultural conglomerates, far removed from aerospace, started reconsidering where they placed their capital. Because what happened to Boeing could happen to anyone. A single policy. A single tweet. A single tariff. That's all it took to derail operations, shake investor confidence, and force multi-billion-dollar recalculations. No amount of legacy, goodwill, or federal support could insulate a company from the new rules of survival. And what were those rules? Global agility. Political neutrality. Cost flexibility. And perhaps above all, narrative control. Because Boeing had lost the ability to shape its story. The headlines weren't about the thousands of planes still flying. They were about the few lines that had shut down. The public didn't see strategic repositioning. They saw abandonment. And when a symbol falls, perception collapses faster than any factory. And the White House? It continued its offensive. More pressure. More threats. More drama. But for Boeing, the path forward was no longer political. It was existential. Either evolve into a decentralized, globally adaptive aerospace leader, or risk becoming a relic of American nostalgia. And so, internally, Boeing shifted its thinking. It began investing in AI-driven logistics to bypass strained trade routes. It streamlined its supply chains to minimize U.S.-dependent bottlenecks. It even restructured some of its labor planning to reflect a future where talent might come from 5 continents, not just 5 states. Because Boeing's boardroom knew something Washington didn't. This wasn't a crisis. It was a transformation. And not just for one company. For the entire American industrial identity. For generations, the U.S. led because it could manufacture better, faster, and cheaper. But now, leadership was no longer about muscle. It was about resilience, flexibility, and adaptation to a world no longer defined by borders but by algorithms, data, and trade zones that shift with every election. So while Trump's rhetoric echoed through rallies, Boeing's engineers wrote a different script. One not fueled by anger, but necessity. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about survival. And this is only the beginning.